Chad Hasty Show, News Talk, 95.1 FM and 790 AM KFYO. A lot of political headlines to talk about today. Let's go to the phones. Visit with GOP political strategist Matt Mackowiak. Matt, good morning. How are you?
Good morning, Chad. I'm doing great.
Great. Thanks for joining us today. It's filing deadline today in Texas. And before we get into some of the people that have already filed and maybe just get your overall thoughts, at least so far, on the statewide stuff, Jerry Patterson wants his old job back. What do you think about that?
Yeah, that's it's funny. I think to a lot of people, that's probably a surprising development.
Yeah.
Given that it's often that you see someone who served in one job not run for re-election, and then because they seek another office, and then 4 years later they run for their old job back. I mean, that is a very unique thing in politics. Now, it is clear that Patterson does not think that the current occupant, George P. Bush, has done a good job. He's been very critical of him in a lot of areas. Bush instituted a pretty sweeping reform of the agency, cleaned out sort of some of the bureaucracy there, made obviously some significantly different hires at the senior levels. And I think Patterson probably felt like that affected people that he'd worked with, or that sort of threatened maybe his legacy to some extent. Obviously, Patterson's fired up about the Alamo, about the vision that George P. Bush, his land commissioner, has for upgrading the facilities at the Alamo and making it much better for tourists and for state history purposes. But that is going to be interesting. I mean, I guess my sense is Patterson is doing this a little bit out of a rivalry with George P., but he may also be doing it because he may think that there's Bush fatigue among Republican primary voters in Texas. I generally don't think that is likely to be successful. I mean, George P. is a very good fundraiser. I actually think he's been a very good land commissioner. But we'll see. Patterson's going to make some arguments against him, and we'll see where it goes. If he does file today, it will be a hot and hotly contested race.
Well, and from a tweet that I believe it was Patrick Svitek with the Texas Tribune sent out, Patterson's logo, if he does indeed file, has the Alamo on it. And so obviously the Alamo is going to be a central feature. Do you think that this is something, I mean, normally Texas Land Commissioner race, it's not high up on the agenda when people go to the polls, and I think a lot of people have no idea what the Texas Land Commissioner does, what the office is. They have no clue about it. Making the central argument about the Alamo, does that bring any more interest into this race between George P. Bush and Patterson?
I think it can, absolutely. It's obviously something that Texans take very seriously. We take a lot of pride in the facility at the Alamo and the fact that we have it and what it means about the story of Texas and how Texas came to be. From my standpoint, I think if you understand the actual specifics of what Commissioner Bush has done there, I think that he has a good story to tell. I think there's been some misinformation, sent around about that, but obviously that will be a big issue in this race if it comes to be. There's no question about that. But you're right. I mean, I think most people don't know what the land commissioner does. I think that's probably even true in Austin, where we're obviously closer to state government. It's kind of a strange office. It has some responsibility for energy, it has some responsibility for education, and it has some responsibility for veterans. But it doesn't have overall responsibility for those issues. It has sort of narrow scope in all three of those areas. And I know that Commissioner Bush was very interested in the office because he'd actually worked in all three of those areas. He'd served in the military, he'd taught in a school, and he'd had some experience in energy and oil and gas as well. So I know that for him, he was very interested in that. The thing for Patterson about this that I really don't quite understand is he was there for quite a while. He had his chance. He did what he wanted to do. He chose not to run for election. He ran for lieutenant governor. And if you remember, Chad, he went after Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick pretty brutally in that campaign, really directly and quite personally. And so it'll be interesting to see kind of whether that factor plays into this at all as well.
Speaking of lieutenant governor race, you have obviously Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick seeking re-election. You have, is it Scott Milder running against him in the Republican primary? Just based off of what we know right now, how do you see that race stacking up?
Yeah, and I'm trying to remember. Is he the Rockwall city councilman, or was, I think? I think that's what his title is. Yeah, I mean, look, it would surprise me if he wins Rockwall against Patrick, to be honest with you. I think Dan's in a very, very strong position. I'm not sure I understand a Republican primary of the sitting lieutenant governor. My guess is, if anything, it's coming from the left, perhaps over things like the bathroom bill. But we'll see. I don't know much about particular candidate. Haven't heard much. I did see he did an interview with the Texas Tribune a couple days ago with Evan Smith in Austin, so I'll have to go back and watch that. But look, Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick, a lot of people have focused on the governor and his strength, and he is in a very, very strong position, both in the primary and the general, with $40 million in the bank as we sit here. But the Lieutenant Governor is also historically strong as well. I mean, he has, I think, a $7 or so million. He has more money in the bank than any Lieutenant Governor in the history of the state of Texas at this time of the election cycle. And Dan, I think, is in very strong shape with Republican primary voters. So I don't think that primary will be much of an issue. You do have Mike Collier, who ran for comptroller and lost by 20 points 4 years ago, and then served as finance director of the state Democratic Party, challenging Patrick in the general election. And there was some discussion that Collier might want or be persuaded to move to the governor's race. That obviously didn't materialize. He's going to stay where he is, and it looks like it'll be Lupe Valdez, the Dallas County Sheriff, or Andrew White, the son of former Governor Mark White, as the Democratic nominee for governor, although there's 8 or 9 people running, and who knows how it will turn out.
Yeah. Let's flip on over to Alabama. Big election tomorrow. A Fox News poll came out today and showed that the Democrat, Doug Jones, was actually up 10 percentage points, and it actually flies in the face of all the other polling just about that's been done over the last few weeks that show that Roy Moore is still leading in that race, and Real Clear Politics has that with, I believe, Roy Moore leading by about 2.5 percentage points in that race. What do you think is going to happen tomorrow night in Alabama?
Boy, it's so hard to say. I mean, in the last couple of days, you had an Emerson poll that had Roy Moore up, I think, 9%. And you had this Fox poll today that has Doug Jones up 10%. I mean, it's rare you see a 19-point range in one race, the day before the election. Clearly, that's a result of the two polls having very different samples in terms of who they think is going to turn out. Special elections are very difficult to predict because the turnout model doesn't ultimately reflect a midterm election or a presidential election. It's kind of a weird singularity, and that's, I think, what the case is here. Look, I think Roy Moore's not campaigning. He's not campaigning at all. I think he's doing one rally tonight with Steve Bannon and Louis Gohmert and a couple people, I forget where, maybe in Huntsville. But he's not campaigning. Doug Jones is campaigning. It's a strange thing. I mean, Moore hasn't done much in the last 3 weeks or so. So that tells me, I think, the more people are confident. Look, Roy Moore won I think it was 4 years ago when he was running for Supreme Court again, with 53% of the vote in a Republican state. I've always believed he's had a low ceiling in Alabama, and he's really shown that. He's never had blowout victories statewide. So, look, I think Jones certainly has had some momentum given the stories that Moore's been dealing with. I also think Moore has sort of stabilized a bit, obviously getting President Trump's support. President Trump has robocalls going out. The president obviously did a rally on Friday night in Pensacola, Florida, right across the border from Alabama, where he was, actively asking people to support Moore. So, look, Chad, this is really hard to predict. I think Moore is slightly more likely to win than not. I think it's going to be close. And ultimately, it's going to come down to Republican women. What do Republican women do? Do they vote for Roy Moore? Do they turn out at all? Do they not turn out? Those are the questions that are going to matter. Doug Jones is not reflective of Alabama. He's pro-choice. He's pretty standard liberal. And so in a normal election year, this would be a 60-40 victory for the Republican candidate. But obviously, this is not an election, not a normal election in Alabama.
If Roy Moore wins, is this going to be, obviously the Democrats are going to try to use this as Republicans or against Republicans in 2018 by saying, hey, we cleaned up our house, Republicans can't clean up theirs. Does that message resonate with voters, though, when the voters are the ones putting Roy Moore into office, not the bigwigs of the Republican Party?
That's an interesting argument, and to some extent, that's maybe the argument that they'll make about President Trump, some of the accusations made against him as well, that the voters had the information and they made the choice anyway. Look, I think Roy Moore is going to have problems if he wins. I think there's going to be an immediate ethics investigation. It wouldn't surprise me if the Republicans in the Senate do not even assign him committees until that investigation is complete. And if the investigation basically finds what the Washington Post report found, which had 30 sources, 8 of which were on the record, it wouldn't surprise me at all if the Senate moved to expel him, which is historically extremely rare. I think it's only even been tried once in the last 50 years, and that was against Bob Packwood of Oregon, Republican of Oregon. He actually resigned before the expulsion vote could occur. And in fact, as a funny little historical fact, the person that was leading the charge on that was actually Mitch McConnell. He was the ethics committee chair at the time. So, look, we'll see what happens. I mean, obviously, all the attention is going to go to the Hill in terms of what Senate Republicans are going to do about Moore if he wins. And I do think Democrats forced Al Franken to resign because they want to be able to attack Republicans over Roy Moore starting Wednesday morning if he wins that election. So obviously, a lot more to see there. If they do an investigation through the ethics committee, Roy Moore will have to defend himself. You'll have the accusers probably come in. That they'll do a rigorous investigation. But my guess is they'll move very, very quickly.
Matt, tell folks how they can sign up for your morning email and also the latest on your podcast.
Yeah, 3,000 Texans receive our Must Read Texas morning email with all the top news sent to your inbox every weekday morning. It is a paid subscription service. You can sign up at MRT, that's M as in Mary, R as in Ryan, T as in Thomas, signup.com. I do have a podcast as well with the Washington Times. It's called Mac on Politics. The most recent episode is with Senator James Langford of Oklahoma. Talk about North Korea, Iran, tax reform. Lots of good stuff. It's available on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, and on the web at maconpolitics.com.
Very good. Matt, appreciate your time today. Have a good one.
Thanks, Chad. Have a great week. Take care.
You too. That's Matt Mackowiak.